My name is Sally Howell. I'm a professor of history here. I'm also the director of the Center for Arab American Studies, and this event is being sponsored by the Center for Arab American Studies, the Middle East Studies Program, and the library, the Meridian Library. So we welcome everyone here. A few months ago, when we were talking about this idea of having a program that looked at current events in the Middle East, the idea was broached to us by a few students and an alum who were really wanting to talk about all the uprisings that are taking place, especially in Iran and Iraq and Lebanon. That was sort of the motivation. One of those people who asked us to do this is in Iraq right now. Another one is in Lansing this afternoon, lobbying the state government over something. So these are people who were motivated to learn more and to take action on the things that matter to them. And you know, in the months since that we had that initial conversation, obviously quite a bit has happened in the Middle East. Many of the uprisings have turned violent. They looked so much more optimistic in the beginning. They've turned perhaps predictably violent. We've almost been brought to the brink of war with Iran. And of course, yesterday, our president signed what he referred to as a peace treaty, but what people in this room might refer to the Palestine in Pieces Treaty, because that's really what it represented. So we're very happy to have so much expertise on these topics, and I consider the people up here sitting next to me to have expertise, but I also consider everyone in this room to have expertise too. So the idea of this afternoon is for us to hear from some of these scholars who have worked on these topics, but also for us to hear from you and for us to have a really an engaged conversation on this subject. So toward that end, just as a little bit of housekeeping, I'm going to, when I leave my position up here, I'm going to come down and pass around some of these sheets. We're going to follow a formula where we ask you to write questions, just because we find that helps facilitate conversation a little more. Some of us tend to perhaps make statements rather than ask questions in a Q&A, so hopefully we'll have a little bit of a cure for that.
Nobody here.
No one here. But anyway, so I'm going to pass these out. So if you have a question for any one of the panelists, and if you can tell us which panelist your question is for, because I think that also makes it easier for us. And I want to also, since I have a room full of people, most of whom were not on hand for our opening on the 17th, there is in the new Stamos Gallery, right past the stairwell, an exhibit called Halal Metropolis, which explores the visibility of the Muslim community here in Detroit through the arts and through history and documentary evidence and things like that. So I want to encourage everybody when they leave this room to go over there to the Stamos and check out our exhibit while you're in the library. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers in alphabetical order, and then they're going to share their insights with you. Deana Abu Ali is the director of the Arab American National Museum in Dearborn. Prior to working at the museum, she was assistant professor at Dartmouth College, head of research and collections at the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, and director of education and outreach at Petra National Trust in Amman, Jordan. She's a board member of Art East and the Palestinian Museum, and she's also a member of the UM-Dearborn Citizens Advisory Committee. She has a PhD in history and Middle Eastern studies from Harvard. Cameron Michael Amin joined the faculty here at Dearborn in 1997 with his PhD from Chicago. He currently serves as the coordinator of the Middle East Studies Certificate Program, principal investigator for the Michigan-Iranian American Oral History Project, and the president of the Association for Iranian Studies. Rifat Dika is a lecturer 4 of Arabic Studies at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. He received a PhD in Sociology of Religion and Middle Eastern Studies from Wayne State University. Saeed Khan is Senior Lecturer of Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at Wayne State University, and he's currently the Director of Global Studies there as well. Ron Stockton is a professor of political science. He teaches courses on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, religion and politics, the politics of revolution, and the politics of the developing area. So let's just thank them all for being up here. Okay. Well, so you negotiate it.
Okay.
Do you guys?
You want to start us off? Say today. Whoever. I figure our guests should go first.
No,
They hear us
no,
talk
no,
all the
please.
time.
Mine is so tangential. Why don't we go to the core first and then move to the periphery as Wallerstein might.
Okay. Ron, you're pretty core. You want to start?
I'm pretty core.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Do I get to stand up here or what?
As you like.
Well, as I like. I'm going to
Yes.
stand up here. If I ask you when the Syrian civil war started, you would say, where's my watch? That's what you would say, because I only got 5 minutes. This is a 45-minute lecture, so you're going to get the fast version.
The highlights.
The highlights, yeah. You would say 2014. I would suggest to you that the Syrian civil war started in 1916. That was when the French and the British decided secretly to divide up the Middle East, as we call it, and to create states designed to serve their own interests, not certainly to serve the interests of local people. You know the Versailles Treaty, which had to do with, after the First World War, had to do with Germany and other issues. The Versailles Treaty had 2 secret clauses in it. Number 1, there shall be a second World War to correct the mistakes of the ending of the First World War. And secret clause number 2, there shall be an Adolf Hitler, because you cannot abuse a country the way the Europeans abused Germany and not expect a pathological reaction. So those were there. Someone who read these secret agreements, the agreements on the Middle East, once they were released, issued a statement that this is not a war to end all wars, this is a peace to end all peace, which is what I think is exactly the case. Because what the French and British did was divide up this region. There were no countries there. This was all the Turkish provinces, Ottoman provinces, and there was no countries. They decided to create little countries designed to their own making, to manipulate the borders, to make them easier to control, and to install ethnic minority regimes, because minorities, you can always control them because they're afraid of everyone else. So this is what they did. They set up a series of countries that had never existed. Now, you're sitting here and you're thinking, you know, if you go back 1,000 years ago, you're going to find something in Baghdad. If you go back 2,000 years ago, you're going to find something in Baghdad. If you go back 1,000 years, you're going to find something in Damascus. All that's true. That's not the countries they created. They created the countries they wanted to create. And they played around and tried to control those countries. So let's look at a country like Lebanon. What they did was decide, they drew a line. Everything north goes to France, everything south goes to the British, and over in the east, you've got Baghdad, that also goes to the British. So look at Lebanon. In 1860, there was some big problems in Lebanon. So what the Turks did, they said, let's just create a little zone north of Beirut. That was where there was a lot of Christian population, among others, some Sunnis as well. They said, let's just create a zone there and allow that to be a self-governing, like an autonomous province. They can kind of look after themselves within the greater empire. If the French had come along and said, you know, they've been doing this now for so many years, since 1860, maybe what we should do is just keep that in place. So when we create these new states, they'll call them mandates, right? And when we create a mandate, we'll just take that and turn that into a mandate. That would sort of been logical, based on history, but that's not what they wanted to do. The French wanted to control this. So they were given this whole area, which today is Syria and Lebanon. They decided to split Lebanon off from Syria. Instead of just taking that area north of Beirut and making a mandate, they decided to push the border of Lebanon to the east, including the Bekaa Valley, which is more logically a part of Syria than it is of Lebanon, pushing the border south, so that they would capture most of the main ports. Now, what do you have? Now, Syria is landlocked, basically, with one little exception, north of Lebanon. You now have, and they installed Christians in power in Lebanon, in a place where Muslims were 48% of the population. Does this sound like an unstable situation? Of course it is. They've created a catastrophe. And then what you have is not a Syria. If you had left those as one big mandate, you would have had a strong, secure Syrian state. That would have been an impressive state. And that's not what they did. They weakened Syria. They installed minority rulers in there. You got a mess. To the south, in Palestine, they brought in Europeans, East European Jews, installed a minority regime there, split Palestine in two parts, the Jewish part, Israel, the Palestinian part, Palestine, which never came into existence. And now you've got an eternal civil war between the Israelis and Palestinians. That is, as far as I can tell, it's never going to end. And then what did they do? Out to the east, I'll tell you, get a map. I just wish I had a map here. If you look at Jordan, Jordan is about 20 miles by 40 or 50 miles. That's where all the people live. Everything out of that's desert. So, but if you look at Jordan, out to the east, there's this big, long strip of land that goes out and connects to Iraq. And you say, what in the world is that? You'll notice something about that. It's a straight line. Okay, I'm going to tell you something. God hates straight lines. Whenever you see a straight line, you know God was not in the room when that map was drawn. That map was not drawn. They didn't ask the local people, what do you want? That map was drawn in Britain, and they did it the way they wanted it. And then you had all sorts of complications because Iraq is a very complex society. Up in the north, you've got Kurds. At one point, they said, let's have a Kurdish state. There's actually a map. There's going to be a Kurdish state. And then they brought in some nice rulers from Saudi Arabia and put them in charge. And they said, okay, we can control this. So they installed a regime to their liking. Let me read you a couple of things. A couple of quotes. Theodor Herzl is the founder of the Zionist movement. In 1896, he wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, the Jewish state, and he called for the creation of a Jewish state. And the next year, he was really a genius. And he organized people. He said, look, anybody can make an argument. Let's start talking about organization. But in that article, pamphlet that he wrote, he said, once a Jewish state is created, we will be loyal to whoever created us because you're going to have to keep us afloat. That's what he said. You will have a loyal ally. Then here is what Osama bin Laden said when he talked about Osama bin Laden, his declaration of war in the United States. 1996, he referred to 80 years of chaos. So I'm going to have my students read this in a couple weeks. I'm going to say, okay, 80 years of chaos. What's he talking about in 1996? What's he talking about? He's talking about Sykes-Picot. That has created chaos. When he later said in a different document, you cannot straighten the shadow if the rod is crooked. Chaos is written into the DNA of these countries. And ISIS, when they took power in northern Iraq and eastern Syria, you know what they did? Some of you will remember. There is a berm. I've never been to this place, but it's kind of a desert area. And there's a berm, just a pile of dirt, which indicates where the border is. And the very first thing they did was get a bunch of young guys out there with shovels, and they dug away that berm. And they said, the Sykes-Picot Treaty has now been reversed. Iraq and Syria are fake countries, and they no longer exist. Isn't that interesting? I want to interview today. My time is up.
Your time is gone, but...
Thank you. I'll sit down then. I'll tell about my
Pick it up
Hamas.
from there.
I'll tell about my Hamas friend later.
Don't worry.
If this was class, you just hold us 5 minutes later, hopefully.
Oh, wait, 1 second.
Yeah.
Well, definitely Iran made my job much easier. We'll talk about Lebanon. Usually it's a big challenge to explain Lebanese politics. Usually it takes like 30 seconds to lose my audience. Start talking. So hopefully this time I'm gonna hold the attention for 5 minutes or so. Okay, so basically what I'm going to do, because as you know, the protest movement in Lebanon, the uprising, you know, some people call it revolution, Thawra, some people call it Hirak, movement against the current system, regime. So, and one of their basic main calls for change or reform is to abolish the sectarian regime, the state, basically in Lebanon, you know, is based on a kind of confederation of sectarian communities. Okay, so Lebanon is unique. It's not like a state with a central government, strong ruler. It's totally different from the rest of the Arab countries. So usually people talk about Hezbollah as like a state within the state. Actually, that's misleading. Of course, Hezbollah has a strong military force, maybe stronger than the state. So from the military perspective, yes, Hezbollah is a state within a state. But if you look at the Lebanese state as a whole, you have 5 or 6 mini states, because every sect has a mini state within the state. Like in every institution, you have, certain civil servants whose loyalty is to the sectarian leader, maybe Verri, Jumblat, or those. So his loyalty is not to the institution, basically, and you have that's very hard to understand how the state functions. So no wonder now it has become a dysfunctional state. So what's the challenge right now? How the main call is to abolish this sectarian state and replace it by a civil, what they call a Dawla al-Madaniya, civil state, like a non-sectarian state, basically based on citizenship, not ethnic or sectarian identity. And this is a big challenge. Okay. So what I'm going to do, what's left of my time, to walk you through like the history, like 3 turning points in the history of Lebanon, and hopefully that later we'll elaborate on each one of them, connect the dots.
You have 2 minutes, 2 minutes.
Already?
Yeah.
Fast or left?
Left.
Whoa!
I'm flying.
I'm going to go fast now. So the first phase in Lebanon after independence, okay, the French were ruling Lebanon. So in 1943, the sectarian leaders in Lebanon got together, Muslim, Christian, Muslim, Shia, whatever, okay, Druze, and they have this a pact called Al-Mithaq al-Watani, okay, the national pact, which basically based on farming the state. Okay, so the state is a quota. I mean, everyone has a corporation. Most of it's like mafia corporation, if you like. So every sect has its like the presidency for Maronite, and across the hierarchical bureaucratic system. Okay, so and this was relatively functional between 1943 and 1975 because the economy was doing well. The corruption was there, but partial, not like generalized corruption. Okay, so those leaders, traditional leaders, were like really somehow, restricted in their corruption, if you like. They stole, but not everything. Okay, so basically we have functional state. The streets were clean. I remember I was a child, was spotless streets, even local area, Beirut, and the place. So it worked very well, and at that time they called it the Switzerland of the East, Swisserstadt. Tourism was good, everything was going great until 1975 in phase 2, which the civil war between 1975 4?
Just so you know, you've used your time, so,
Wow.
so.
Okay, can I borrow 2 minutes? I told you. Okay, this is Civil War. Let me just say what happened after Civil War. I'm not going to go through, we don't have time. So basically what happened in Civil War, in the first phase, the notables ruled Lebanon, traditional leaders. Those leaders were gone during the Civil War. It was like a convoluted Civil War for 15 years. It's so many civil wars, not just one, okay? Like Syria is involved after the Iran Revolution, Hezbollah came in the 80s, Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982 and destroyed Beirut. So basically, the old authority was replaced by new leaders. Basically, militia warlords or militia leaders came, like Nabi Berri consolidated the Shia, Hezbollah. So we have a consolidation of the sectarian communities. It's to be like diverse, politically speaking. But now you have like the Shia, we have Hezbollah and Amal, and you have the Sunni Al-Hariri, okay, who was the businessman who became prime minister and consolidated the Sunni, and among others. So the point here is corruption under this new system, okay, which I call sectarian state farming, generalized corruption, growing national debt. Like even during the Civil War, Lebanon has no debt, basically. But after the end of the Civil War in 1991, so we have this new Ta'if agreement, okay? And under this neoliberal kind of economic policies, Lebanon has started to accumulate debt and corruption. All this money was not really invested in productive economy, okay? Until up today, it has like around $100 billion with totally dysfunctional state. Garbage are not picked up, no electricity, environmental pollution, unemployment, you name it. So this is where the Hirak came in, and I hope we could elaborate more on this later. Thank you.
Hi. We began organizing this roundtable late last year. And at that time, the latest episode of civic unrest in Iran, that's really not easy to do, is that talk, trip over a chair, appeared to have ended actually in November. Protests against the end of subsidies for gasoline, which had resulted in a drastic increase in gas prices. These protests escalated in scale, in scope, and in violence. And the success of the government in cracking down on these protests led me to think about previous incidents of unrest in Iranian history, and in modern Iranian history. And as a historian, when I say modern, of course I mean now, but I also mean everything in the last 200 years. I'm sorry about that. It's all one big. This table, from a report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, issued right before the November protests of last year, illustrates I'm not the only one inclined to think about this in historical terms or with historical precedents in mind. Some of the most significant political changes in Iranian history began as local or single-issue protests, aggravated by economic distress, that became nationalized through modern communication. First telegraph and press, then telephone, and now, of course, the internet. A few of these protests did force change, either in government policy or in the very nature of Iranian government, notably in 1906 and, as you may know or have heard, in 1979. But as you can see from this table, if you're squinting, you can get a copy of this later if you want. Most of these protests, in fact, fail under the weight of state oppression. They're snuffed out. Now, I might add a success or two to this table. For example, in 1919, during the last years of the Qajar dynasty, popular protests successfully pressured members of Iran's young parliament to reject a treaty that would have reduced Iran to becoming a virtual protectorate of Great Britain, kind of avoiding the Sykes-Picot fate that my colleagues have talked about. But there were some failures to add to the list. For example, in the summer of 1935, the second decade of the Pahlavi dynasty, protests in the city of Mashhad against a new hat law, which people were correctly worrying might lead to a forced unveiling law, were met with military action. The army was rolled out. The success or failure of these protests, however big they became, depended very much on how unified the political elites were and how much control they could retain over the coercive power of the state. And it was only 10 years ago that a fracturing of the Islamic Republican political elite after a contested presidential election in 2009 fueled speculation that the Islamic Republic might not be able to withstand a nationalized level of protest facilitated by social media. But the Islamic Republic has simply increased the coercive power of the state to match the determination and desperation of the protesters. Would-be defectors from the political elite were quickly neutralized. And even loyalist attempts to reform the system from within have been checked over and over again through repressive but fully legal through Iran's constitution institutional responses. What I thought in November of last year was that the crucial difference between the protests in November and the domestic unrest in the past is that the protests now are coupled with economic pressures that are very closely tied to Iran's unprecedented level of regional assertiveness. Not since the height of the Iran-Iraq War have more Iranian forces and resources been directed outside of its borders. Protesters have often included chants protesting against Iran's policies in Syria or in Yemen or in Iraq, including during the ones in November of 2019. This is because everyone in Iran understands that Iran's regional adventurism has served as the principal rationale behind the economic sanctions imposed on it by the rest of the world, especially the US. Recall that the main case against Iran's legal, civilian, and treaty-based nuclear energy program is its potential to be converted into an illegal, treaty-violating nuclear weapons program, and that would threaten regional adversaries like Saudi Arabia and Israel. Iran's economic miseries due to these sanctions are quite acute, and in the wake of the current, especially in the wake of the current administration's maximum pressure campaign. And these two maps illustrate the widespread nature of economic stress, called the map of misery index. The nice provinces have unemployment rates of 42%. That's a good province. And this other slide looks at the number of distribution of dead in the most recent protests. So you can see that the pain is distributed, the protests are distributed, and there's obviously a connection. Nothing illustrated the connection between foreign policy and domestic unrest in Iran more clearly than the US assassination of Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad on January 3rd. The Islamic Republic was able to mobilize, actually, crowds around nationalist outrage over his death. But as soon as the truth came out about its own downing of a Ukrainian airliner on January 8th, with dozens of Iranians and Canadian Iranians on board, the frustrations of November returned. This is a sort of telegram posting by students at Amir Kabir University on January 12th. And amidst a new crackdown as the protests resurged, they issued this on Telegram asking to separate their democratic demands from international and regional politics. And this got attention of local observers in the region and of course around the world. And I'm going to close with the translation of part of that excerpt so you can reflect on it and just give you a sense of how these things are connected, both protesting the government, the pressures that lead to protests of the government, and how people in the country, or at least the students in the country, see their plight. And I will stop there and yield to our excellent colleagues from Princeton. Thank you. Let me get out of here so you can use your... Let's see, where are you?
One solitary slide.
There you go.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, great. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. So I'd actually like to segue from Dr. Amin's discussion on Iran to Iran. But first I'd like to go ahead and, I'm big on anniversaries, except those in my own life. 2020 is certainly one that looms largely within the Middle East. It is a 100th year anniversary for the Treaty of Sèvres, which quite literally severed the Ottoman Empire into the constituent parts and essentially created the Middle East as we understand it as a manifestation of the Sykes-Picot Agreement that Dr. Stockton talked about. It's also 50 years this year marking the death of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who certainly had a very pivotal role in shaping the Middle East, and we are certainly with the legacy of that. Also happens to be the 50th anniversary of the Beatles breaking up, and the 40th anniversary of the U.S. release of the Clash's London Calling. So I will leave it up to you as to playing on your strengths, your passions, and your priorities. Having said that, when it comes to Iran today, I'm reminded of not only some of the epochal moments that Dr. Amin mentioned, but how it represents one of these countries that was embroiled in the great game. That being the destiny of Iran, shaped by the whims and the wants of other powers. Iran served as a buffer state between Russia and the burgeoning British presence in South Asia. We find that, like the Ottoman Empire, it was put into a position where it had to give concessions, the Treaty of Turcomanchai in 1828 being one of them. The tobacco protest, of course, launching, well, not 1,000 ships, but certainly 1,000 complaints and more. But then you also have, of course, the 1901 oil concession, which Muzaffar Ali Shah gave to William Darcy. Not the same Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. Had it been so, then I'm sure Elizabeth Bennet would have accepted his proposal much earlier. And in many ways, we see then the destiny of Iran shaped around, and this is unsurprising, oil. In 1901, we have then the genesis of what becomes known as the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation, based in Abadan, the port city. And for those of you who are familiar with particularly the rather sordid history in the 1950s, after Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, within his rights by international law, nationalized the oil industry, we find that the British certainly cajoled two different American administrations to try to remove Mossadegh from power. The British were less successful with Truman, who was a little bit busy and distracted with things going on the 38th parallel in Korea. Certainly milder times than Korea today. And then in 1953, striking gold with President Eisenhower and the Dulles brothers, both at the State Department as well as at the Central Intelligence Agency. That brings us past the revolution and past some of the acrimony that certainly exists between how the Iranians may see the United States, and certainly how the United States and the current administration, more particularly, sees Iran. But there's a new interloper in the region, and that is China, bringing back a trope that is at least 652 years old. In 1368, the founder of the Ming Dynasty decided to shut the so-called Silk Road, this overland highway that extended from China all the way through Asia Minor and reached Europe. He was, of course, quite frightened by the idea that certain ideas were going to penetrate and encroach China, and he decided that there was no longer the need, or at least certainly in a cost-benefit analysis, the need for the Silk Road. It, of course, opens up maritime sea routes much more exuberantly. To paraphrase Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, trade finds a way, and certainly we find then that it leads and unleashes to the kind of colonial and imperial enterprises that ensue from the 15th century onwards. But everything old is new again, and perhaps the Silk Road is the ultimate example of retro. Now we find it as being rebranded by China as the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a rather ambitious project, which is estimated to be $1 trillion or more of investment in infrastructure that China is going to be embarking in up to 60 different countries. Now, this is a road that's not only going to be overland all the way from China to the Dutch port city of Rotterdam, but also China is going to shore up its maritime routes to become, in effect, a two-ocean power. Part of the way that it is planning on doing this is with developing existing ports, expanding and digging deep water ports in places like Gwadar in Pakistan, but also creating a series of archipelagos, artificial islands or atolls, if you will, to form a string of pearls in its own parlance, going from the South China Sea all the way to the Horn of Africa. I think India has a lot to worry about when it comes to that. And China is not going to be stopped, or it's not going to be inhibited by some of the machinations of the United States in the area. I think it's quite telling, as a matter of fact, that as the assassination of Qasem Soleimani was occurring, simultaneously the Iranians were conducting joint naval exercises with both China and with Russia. We find there's also, given the extent and the depth of the embargoes and the sanctions placed on Iran, China seems to be emboldened to, in its own rather furtive and perhaps nuanced way, circumventing the impact of how this will then affect its own relationship, both with Iran as well as with the United States. A $10 billion influx to Iran to help stabilize the economy is one example of this. Also, the recognition that Iran has upwards of 8% of its imports coming from China, in exchange, of course, for oil, which is something that China needs desperately. And this then provides an understanding about how, in many ways, geography is going to be at least as important as ideology and other forces. Because as you notice here, the Silk Road, or the BRI, will be going through Iran, and you see the level of penetration of the maritime routes to its southern border in the Persian Gulf. That means that China is now going to increase its position and its footprint within the Persian Gulf and the Middle East particularly, as we see a rather mercurial relationship that the United States has, particularly with this particular foreign policy. I've got 6 minutes?
You've spoken for 6 minutes.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, then that's it. I thought you were going to flash me signals, but
You
after
weren't looking over here, so
Oh.
I just.
You were in the zone.
I thought you were going to say I'm one of the Astros, so.
Just hover by that.
Oh, yes.
There you go. There you are.
Okay, I'm gonna talk briefly as I can about sort of art and this revolutions, the role of art, what's been produced. So much lighter topic to end with. You know, for many years, and this isn't new, artists in the Middle East and the Arab world have been contributing to sort of revolutionary movements, have been very political, and you know, have been sort of subversive in the work that they do. And the reason that art is so, I think, powerful, especially in sort of revolts, is that they're able to capture the zeitgeist, the sort of the ideology of the movement very succinctly. And in an Arab case, I think in other parts of the world happens as well, it's usually very humorous. I think humor is an essential ingredient in a lot of the protest art that you see, not just, I'm only going back as far as 2011 but also in the past year or two with the more recent uprisings that we have. Artists have been targeted by governments in the Middle East for you know, as long as we can remember. This is nothing new. I mean, artists, political caricaturists, if you like Najib Ali, a Palestinian cartoonist, was killed. Ali Farzad, who was a Syrian political cartoonist in the early days of the Syrian war, was, you know, his hands were broken because of all the cartoons he do. So artists are very brave in the sense that they challenge the governments, they're subversive, and they're often very much targeted by these regimes. So I'm going to look at very briefly at three kind of artists and regions. One of them is Egypt, and this is a famous cartoon by an artist called Mohammed Fahmy, or Ganzir, which means chain. he's a, you know, he started during Tahrir. He did some artwork, but this was produced in September of last year and went viral. And this is something that I think new with the art form that's produced now, as opposed to say in 2011 in Tahrir, in the sort of Syrian civil war, what have you, at the beginning, is that, you know, there is the sort of digital technology that we had back then, which was Twitter and Facebook, but it's sort of, you know, gone in overdrive now. We didn't have Instagram, it was present, but it wasn't as popular as it is today. So these things are produced on Twitter, and then they're sort of published and printed by people and stuck around. I actually saw it in Houston. I was there over Christmas break. So he actually lives in Houston. He's in exile. Another sort of, so we have sort of visual art. We also have musical art, song, and again, not something new. If you could think about artists like Sheikh Imam, who wrote a lot of protest songs during the years of, he's an Egyptian artist, him and Muhammad Fuad Najm during the years of Nasser and Sadat. Anyway, Rami Issam, very famous singer. He's known as sort of the singer of the revolution, appeared in Tahrir in 2011. Just a shameless plug, he is performing this summer here in Detroit again in Dearborn at our Jama festival, so you should come. He was here last summer. He's currently also in exile in Sweden, and he's done a series of songs. He's in exile. He's not allowed to go back. Well, he could go back, but he will be arrested. His passport apparently was taken. And this song, Belaha, I don't think we have any time. I could play. It's a lot of his songs, like most of these sort of political songs, are satires and biting commentaries and criticisms of, in this case, Mohammed Sisi, the president of Egypt. And he calls him a balaha, which is a date, but it's also a reference to something stupid or somebody stupid. The person who wrote this song, by Bilal Buhairi, was immediately after the release of the video, he was arrested and put into jail for 3 years. So immediate consequences of this kind of art. This song, one of the songs that Rami Issam has done, just to show you about the interconnectedness of these different revolts. I'm not going to play, but if you can go to Ganzir's Twitter feed, he has a song called, like I say in Arabic, but it's called The Age of the Pimp. I'll say it. Anyway, and it's very vulgar. Sorry. But you see it, they play it in there's one shot where, you know, these protesters in Beirut have it singing in the background. So clearly there's a sort of connection between what's going on in Cairo, in Beirut, and elsewhere. Sudan, I want to sort of finish up with Sudan. There's a lot of interesting street art that's been happening since the revolt, the uprising started last December in 2018. You know, once these austerity measures were released or announced, rises in food price, and there was a kind of mass, you know, uprising and revolt and demonstration against the president and its regime in Sudan. That eventually brought down Bashir. So a lot of street art, like I said, a lot of it's sort of organic, responding immediately to the moment. And this is sort of what we see in a lot of the street art that is produced in these uprisings. They're very much for the public sphere, for public consumption. So this says, if you do not receive freedom and peace and justice, don't leave your places, don't leave your positions. For many others have died for that cause. So sort of slogans, uplifting the spirit of the people. So this art is also documentary, it's documenting what's going on, but it's also can provide a sort of hope for the future. A lot of digital art again is used, and also, you know, kind of distributed digitally, so that's a very important, like I said, factor, and we see it in Sudan as well. This is the Blood Loaf by Abdurrahman al-Nazir. We see a lot of women in the protests. I don't know if you remember from last winter, spring. Very much, you know, women were out on the streets, and we see echoes of this also in Lebanon right now. A lot of women are there. It's a women's revolution, and this is by a cartoonist or an artist called Ala Satir. She says, this revolution is a women's revolution. Literally girls, but she means a women's revolution. Ya banat ibqu thabat. So all women stay in your places, stay firm. Just to talk about the creativity of the art that's being produced, So in Sudan, henna art, sort of using henna to create designs, very common, very popular among women. It apparently has also been, kind of appropriated and used for people. They've been drawing political slogans, messages on their arms using henna, and also in this case, I believe, using sort of like a Sharpie permanent marker. So this is a man. I couldn't find any of a woman with a henna tattoo that has a political message. But here we're using, instead of using the walls as a kind of canvas that you would see in public art, or even the stage, like in Tahrir, where you have public performances, here we have the body as the canvas. Of course, very dangerous, because if you're carrying a flyer or a placard, you can just throw it. You can't, throw away your arm. So it's doubly, kind of dangerous. And for me, it reminded me of what you see on the right is a Palestinian thobe, or traditional dress that was produced during the first Intifada in the late 1980s. It's called an Intifada dress because on it has images or embroidery of the Palestinian flag, the Palestinian colors, which were prohibited by the Israelis to be shown. So what the women started to do, and this is not traditional embroidery, we don't have flags, they started embroidering the flags and the colors as a way of showing protest. So somehow taking this sort of traditional form of art and appropriating it for the purposes of the political situation. That's it. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. That's a great slide to leave it on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to circulate around the room. If you guys have questions, please write them down on the pieces of paper that hopefully you have, so that I can share them with the panelists. But before that, I have the privilege of asking the first question. So the thing I would like to know is, so I am reminded, I think, about the Arab Spring. Of course, that's something that has really come up as we think about these new street protests that we're seeing across the region, and how it seems to me that the protesters themselves are also very aware of the Arab Spring. And they're aware of how the Arab Spring ended, which was not very well for their various political campaigns. So I think I would like you to help us sort of understand how these demonstrations are being organized differently, how they're being articulated differently, and what their goals are in comparison to that earlier set of goals. And maybe we can start with Ron and go down the line.
Oh, I don't know anything about those protests, but I'll tell you something. I had a conversation with a person, I'm not going to give you his name, but many of you would know it. He said to me, the next street protests are going to be in Saudi Arabia. He said the tension in Saudi Arabia among young people is so great, it's just ready to explode. Something will set it off. You can look forward to that. I think was it Mao who said, when the grass is green, a small spark can start a prairie fire? When there's so much tension, something can start it off. And it's impossible for us sitting here, or even people who are far more knowledgeable than I am, to say what that spark will be. But something will set it off, because the conditions of tension are so great. So that's my thought.
I think, yeah, I agree with Sally that the events of Tahrir and the kind of aftermath of that, Syria, Libya, that's still very much in the minds of people in the Middle East or in the Arab world. But I think the demands are still very similar to what they were there. Basically, it was end corruption, provide end corruption and political corruption, provide a decent, provide job opportunities for people, improve the economy. They're not, more franchise, more, democracy, participation in government and politics. They're not very different, the demands. But I think, I think there's a little more savviness in the way that they're organizing. I think, for instance, what was happening in Beirut was very hopeful, and that it was very much anti-sectarian. And once it sort of would turn a little bit sectarian, they would kind of, stop and regroup and try to remind themselves of the purpose of the revolt. It was to end the sort of sectarian divides and really create a political system that's based on citizenship and not on one sect. But I don't know, to be honest, I don't know how hopeful I am, only because the only country where there was a revolution and it was successful was Tunis. And the reason it was successful is because it had a viable and healthy civil society, and a long-standing one. They had very strong unions in Tunis. They had a strong education system. There were certain things in place that allowed Tunisia to come out of that period of chaos and to sort of move ahead. I think it's doing a pretty good job. I don't know if that exists in other Arab countries. We can revolt, but is there sort of, are there institutions in place like there was in Tunis to uphold the change? Not to mean that, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be protests or anything, but I don't know how it's going to move forward with the absence of certain institutions to allow people to become democratic, to vote, to have people transition out in and out of power and what have you. So yeah.
I could talk about Lebanon. I mean, the unique thing about Lebanon, those demonstrations are not like against repressive rules. Actually, it's like Syria, for example. It started in Syria in 2011. In Lebanon, it's basically about the government corruption. I mean, about really on an everyday basis, people are fed up. There are no services, electricity for 30 years. They don't have electricity. So, like we have to buy electricity beside, so we have like 2 bills to pay. Problem with picking up the garbage, as simple as that. It's not done. Among other things. The new thing in Lebanon that, historically speaking, there has been political parties like leftist and liberal, Al-Almaniyun. They've been talking about separating church from state, to put in American terminology. But for the first time, this call is coming today from the street. And there's this total identification between sectarian politics and corruption. So that's why when they say kullun yani kullun, like all of them means all of them, that's what it really means, that they mean all corrupt, and we don't want any sectarian politics anymore. Not because that religious institutions in Lebanon are repressive, maybe they are a little bit, but because the corruption now has a sectarian tool. Okay? And that's, I think, the new element. This is the challenge. How we're going to do this, because institutions are sectarian at all levels. So that's basically the big risk and hope and challenge at the same time.
In all the countries we've talked about, a couple of things have been happening. Big picture things have been happening. Populations are growing, they're younger, they're more urbanized, they're more educated. All those things were true, and all those things put demands on the government to produce improvements. People expect if they go to college, they're not going to be cab drivers afterwards, for example. A lot of engineering cab drivers in town. And beyond that, there's also an awareness and sophistication, not just about their own countries and their own history and their own recent past, but what else is going on in the world. You saw in some of the art, the way they were sort of bringing in some European and other symbols to kind of, there's a sense that things can be better, that and that the current political structures just aren't intent on delivering it. And so what was striking me about the Arab Spring, and also about the different but close in time, the Green Movement protests, is that in the initial phases there's this strange, I wasn't sure in the moment if it was an attempt to cynically appropriate the kind of ideological positions of the state by making reference in the Iranian case to sort of the martyrs of the Iran-Iraq War, the martyrs of the revolution, and the kind of the stories about how that revolution overthrew a tyrant, to sort of remind the current leadership in Iran where they're supposed to have come from in terms of the idealism of their revolution, how it's supposed to apply to them. Because in all the Arab countries too, you have number of different important dates in July from different regime changes where things were supposed to make it, whether it was the Ba'athist change here or there are these, or in Egypt, for example, with all of that, the free officers. Something was supposed to come with that, and there'll be generations of folks who thought that to an extent it might have begun. And so on the one hand, there's this notion that things could be better because there have been moments in time when they've been better, and that it requires, though, the inclusion of, I say, all the people and all the civic institutions. So, and then you have these repressive crackdowns. So even though the protesters are initially not necessarily violent, and invoking like idealism and civic stuff, and it gets cracked down, the question for me is how much more cynical it's become or not. And what sort of impressed me or moved me, I guess, is if you saw that student statement, it's not a cynical statement at all. It's utterly realistic, but it's also got high expectations for what Iran's supposed to be able to do. And I suspect that's true in all the countries we're talking about. So I think what fuels it is this fact, well, there's not much else they can do. These pressures that Said was talking about on the region, those are shaping things. A lot of the protests in Syria, there was one study that talked about some of the regional protests, the provincial protests, were at least aggravated by the fact that there was more difficult environmental conditions in those provincial areas, and the state wasn't responding. Like in Iran, there's often complaints about water distribution, for example. So, sorry, I'm over answering your question.
Well, that's okay. I mean,
Yeah.
ecologists, just to come back to this, ecologists are saying that really all of this can be attributed in part to global warming and the fact that it's changing the water distribution, agriculture, driving more people off the land. I mean, where is global warming going to affect people first? In the hottest places and in the wettest places. And that's basically what we're seeing here.
Migration patterns as well. You asked the question about what is the legacy of the Arab Spring. I mean, so much has been assessed, as you said, that people have paid attention to this in the region. They've looked beyond their own countries to try to assess it. And I think the point that you made about Tunisia is so very important. You have a civil society which had the kind of space and the apparatus to deal with this. But I think there's also another aspect. I mean, protests are nothing new in the region. They're nothing new in the world. But it has to do with agency. And perhaps the best way to delegitimize any kind of movement is for people to suspect as though the strings are being pulled from outside. So when it comes to Libya, at least until now, it was a movement after post-Gaddafi which was seen as organically developing from within to a certain degree. Now with Khalid Haftar and who's pulling the strings on that is taking it into a different orbit. Bahrain was seen as a movement which was then suppressed from the outside. Saudi Arabia drawing tanks across the causeway, treating Bahrain as just like the Florida Keys, just something offshore. Egypt, there was the Pride of Tahrir because it was a movement that the Egyptians had from within. But the disillusionment of 2013 being from external forces, primarily from the Gulf, to scupper what was still an inchoate regime of Mohamed Morsi. Which leads us to Iran. 1892, the tobacco protest was something from within. The constitutional movement up to 1905, 1906 was from within. There's also the scars of 1953, where the coup d'etat was imposed from outside. 2009 was seen as protest from within without being gained. And right now, the 2019 disturbances and the protests are maintaining the sanctity in the public that it is something from inside. If it is ever thought that there are the hidden or not so hidden hands of external forces, it's difficult to see how that's going to then maintain the legitimacy of this coming from within. But one point I think that's important to see where the trajectory is going is I think it's very telling that in the investigation of the Ukrainian jet downing, who has been selected or appointed to lead the investigation, and this is Ibrahim Raisi, who many are now considering to be Khamenei's successor. And I don't know how much of the protests or how much of the street is really responding to this, because he is seen as at least as hardline as Khamenei, and perhaps maybe even more so. So stay tuned to see how this then is going to affect the narrative of the protest movement in Iran.
So I want to remind people, if you have questions, please pass them down so I can read them to the participants. So rather than do one question and have you guys respond, I'm going to read the 4 questions I have, because you're going to see they are very, very diverse in orientation. And you can. So the first one is directed toward Dr. Deana. Will the cross-sectarian Lebanese revolution currently happening be powerful enough to take on the strong political, ideological affiliations people hold in the country? And so I think we've already addressed that to a certain extent, but perhaps there's a little bit more to be said here. Another asks, as experts in Middle Eastern culture and history, can you speak to the potential effects of what we can expect as a result of our president's actions? And there's a lot of material there for you to discuss. A third one, why did America decide to become entangled in the Arab-Israeli conflict? I don't really see a specific reason or motive. It isn't just oil or gas. That's one question. And again, all of these questions, we want to see you in our classrooms. So the fourth one says, what will the future of the Gulf states be as the world transitions away from oil and natural gas? So these are really, really different questions. So
if I can, that very last one about why is the U.S. involved, particularly one of the things to recognize about the U.S.'s role in the region is that, to some extent, our early presence in the Middle East is missionary, early 19th century, because the big Western players in the Middle East, whether it's France or whether it's Great Britain, they were the ones in charge. In fact, American consulates were usually trying to work on trade and protect missionaries. They really were engaging in sort of the geopolitical stuff. That begins to change, though, really with World War I, and that's when you begin to see the U.S. getting much more involved initially to try to interrupt some of the colonial ambitions of the French and the British. But ultimately, what happens after World War II is, as the British and the French retreat from their various stations around the world, the U.S. steps into their script. That's the sort of big reason why we get involved. There are other reasons. There's you could talk about the influence of the Zionist movement outside in Europe and in the U.S., but that doesn't really have an impact until later. But you also have a group called sort of is it Restorationists, late 19th century Christians who are interested in the same sort of it predates slightly, but that is sort of the same time as the rise of Zionism and European Jewish sort of returns to Palestine, which began before World War I. That's the other thing I kind of want to underscore is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is pre-World War I. It's accelerated in certain ways with World War I, but it's pre-World War I. Our involvement begins kind of where French and British involvement begins to end. But to simplify it tremendously.
Okay, about Lebanon, well, that's a $1 million question about the chance of success for the non-sectarian. But it is, as I mentioned earlier, this time it is raised on the ground. Like before, it was raised by elitists, like secularists, like the Hizb al-Qawm al-Suri or the Communist Party in Lebanon, but they were like on the margin of, but seriously, no one before raised the issue of eliminating the sectarian political quota system until now. So with this kind of passion, but again, those groups are marginal, okay? Some of them are like from the left, some of them are like secularist, new young generation, but politically speaking, until now, they have not generated real movements. I mean, the potential is there. Why? Because the sectarian system has really consumed itself, I mean, by now. I mean, they exist because they are there, because they they control the institutions, the police, okay, but they spend their energy, if you like. Okay? So, well, that's an open question. The potential is there. Well, it depends on how the new, movement will be able to generate energy and organization to put pressure on the existing regime. Okay, like by starting changing the electoral system. Okay, which is now sectarian. I mean, all the parliament and everything else is distributed based on the sect. So this is the first step. Now it's raised in the street, okay? But the potential again is going to be uphill struggle.
Just the thing to watch, I think, in all these countries is where the political elites wind up on things, and particularly certain institutions, especially the military. I mean, all during the Arab Spring, especially, my question was, so where's the military on this? And as if you look at how things unfolded, they were crucial. Looking who's in that because they're the most well-resourced. They're the biggest patronage system in any one of these countries is the military.
Well, in Lebanon, the military is multi-headed, so there's no danger of
In
military
Lebanon,
rule.
it's a little different, but in
Yeah,
Egypt, it's
but
not
in
just-
Egypt it's
they-
different story.
They own everything. I mean,
Right.
they own the society, and so
It's like and these notion of a sort of a state state-managed economy with sort of private-public partnerships. Only really what they are is that there are these state corporations that, if you want to have a business, you kind of have to work within a sort of state system. It's a bit like the PLA in China, or I mean that's true in Iran, and so that's another reason why a lot of popular protest is against government actors and elites, because it's hard to get in on that system. They know that the government controls the opportunities, not
It's
just.
become a lot more or less like a caste system, economically.
or just a closed system, like
Yeah.
here in the United States, these two political parties now have so
Love them.
divided that
Yeah.
you can't operate outside of that system, and that system doesn't seem to be serving the interests of the people anymore. So, I mean, in my opinion, anyway, I'm not one of the panelists. So, do the rest of you have things to add?
What were the 4 questions again?
So
Yeah.
there was one about the future of the Gulf states. As this was an optimistic one, as the world transitions away from oil and gas. I mean, only optimistic because we wish that were happening faster. The Lebanese one, I think, was answered. The potential effects of the current president's policies in the region, and the question about American involvement, I think Cam answered. So.
Okay. As far as the one regarding the Gulf states, and I think you framed it as a reduced role in natural gas and oil, I'm not sure if that's really happening. It seems as though the center of gravity may be shifting, but natural gas and oil are still going to play very big roles. In fact, right now, there is the issue of natural gas in the Eastern Mediterranean, and who is making an effort to try to mine that. We find that particularly Israel is interested in deep water exploration, and the fact that there is a proposed pipeline that involves Israel, Cyprus, and Greece, which would then circumvent the need for Russia and Turkey's pipelines into Europe by having the benefit of an EU country, Greece, and Cyprus being present in that capacity. That can cause a paradigm shift in the region, particularly when it comes to Israel's involvement in a natural resource like natural gas. So this is not over. And then, of course, the extremely large cache of oil that has been discovered in Iran. So I'm not sure that I could respectfully accept the premise that the region is having a diminution in its significance regarding oil. And as I said before, given the Belt and Road Initiative, given Iran's central location within that and Chinese designs, some reports are actually even framing it as saying that Iran is going to be China's gas station and way station as it is creating a BRI going east and west and back and forward. So yeah, as far as I think the Gulf states, They probably were really hoping that there was going to be more of an intensification in the relationship with Iran. They were certainly successful in that compared to how the American posture was under Obama, one of diplomatic engagement. And of course, we know now that the JCPOA is completely shattered, and the consequences from that. But I think it's also important to recognize that underneath, there's a subterfuge of failures when it comes to the Gulf states in being able to capitalize and exploit American deference to some of their actions. And you see this particularly in the case of Yemen. This has been a complete catastrophe for Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The UAE has already withdrawn much of its full support and military support in the region rather surreptitiously. The Saudis have also brokered a loose ceasefire with Yemen, and again, doing so under the cloak and veneer of secrecy, because they realize that it's a face-saving imperative that calls for it. But you won't hear these things discussed ever on the street in Riyadh or in Jeddah or in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi.
Let me talk about our president. Not really about our president. We're status quo power. We're the dominant power in the world. That's changing, but for the time being, we're the tops. A country should focus on its own interests. This is a school of international studies, international relations called the realist school. You focus on what is your own interests. So what interests do we have? First is maintaining the status quo. Anybody that's disrupting something, we should be against it. We should go the other direction and say, no, you can't disrupt this. No, we're not going to allow that. Our goal should be to stabilize the region. That's a very critical region because of a whole host of things, one of which, of course, is oil. You have so much oil in that region. And we live on look at this. You see this? Made out of oil. You see this? Oil. I mean, oil. It's everywhere. We're having our status quo disrupted. We're having our influence disrupted by, I think the Israeli lobby is disrupting our influence. Who do we send to negotiate a peace settlement between the Israelis and Palestinians? Two people who are connected to the settler movement. I mean, it's amazing. Our chief negotiator was someone who said Jews who criticize the settlers are capos. I mean, these are Nazis. He called them Nazis, basically. What did I mean? This is the person we trusted. So we've got a really bad situation. And I'm just carrying with me. Look what I have here. Oh my gosh, this is the deal of the century. I tell you. If Jared can't do it, who can? Well, Jared can't do it. I've been reading. I just read the first 40 pages, and I had a nice long interview with the Jewish News this morning. But I read this. These are basically Bibi talking points. These are the arguments that Bibi Netanyahu makes. I mean, some of the things, it's hard to believe that he didn't write it. I mean, maybe he did. I don't know. Raising issues that nobody's raising just because, like, the Palestinians have to change their textbooks. The Palestinians have to completely dismantle Hamas and create a peaceful situation in Gaza. And until that's done, the Israelis are not obligated to do anything. Okay? Who wrote that? I don't know. But I'm thinking to myself, we should be trying to stabilize the situation. The purpose of an Israeli-Palestinian negotiation process should not be to bring justice to the Palestinians. The Palestinians will never get justice. The Palestinians, the goal should be to prevent the next war. That should be our goal, to prevent the next war. This is basically incitement to the next war. That's what this is. And so, what is our president's role? Catastrophic.
Yeah, and you talked about Israel-Palestine. You didn't talk about Iran, or Iraq, or Syria. All
Well,
these
I
other
think we
places
just
where-
got a string of things, don't
Yeah,
we?
yeah.
But look, we saw Putin coming in Right now, Assad would be in exile if it hadn't been for Putin. Okay, what should our position be on that? We're trying to not destabilize the situation. We're in a really bad situation. I don't see a solution to many of these problems, but I think our president is the least person you would want to be in charge of a really, really bad situation.
I have a few questions, but before that, yeah.
I mean, clearly Trump is sort of an extremist in many ways, but I don't think the deal that's presented is very much a deviation from American foreign policy towards Palestinians.
This deal?
It's not, no. I mean, there's never been, America is a sort of, never been an honest broker. The U.S. policy has never been like, let's get justice for the Palestinians. I mean, this is sort of, again, maybe it's the usual U.S. administration stance on steroids, but it's not really that much. I mean, I'm not surprised by what has come out. I'm not shocked by it. So, I mean, whether it's Trump or somebody else, I mean, Obama wasn't very good on Arab-Israel. Clinton wasn't, Bush was. I mean, it's just more of the same, just sort of taken to a more intense degree.
I was going through, as I was reading this, and I read it quickly. I was making checks on where these are basically abandonments of longstanding U.S. positions. Number one, annex the West Bank. Okay, that's no American president has ever taken anything close to that.
No American president has really tried to stop the settlements. I mean, the settlements are an annexation of the West Bank. They're facts on the ground. You're not going to dismantle. I mean, every settlement that's built is one step closer to annexation of the West Bank.
Secondly, 194, which says that the solution is to return Palestinians or be compensated. Obviously, they're not going to return to Israel, but they could return to a Palestinian state. This says they can't return to a Palestinian state unless the Israelis clear each and every one of them. And if they come from places where there's anti-Israeli sentiment, they mention Lebanon and they mention Syria, those are sort of no-nos. This is totally different from anything any American president has ever said. So there's a whole series of things, the annexation of the Golan province, breaking the international consensus. These are all really deviations. We could debate this, but I think this president has taken positions which are dramatically different from any position ever taken by any American president.
And I think actually that was part of his campaign promise. So, so I have a few other questions, and I'm aware of the clock. We technically have 10 more minutes. So, but these take us in very different directions. So one person wants to know the role Turkey will play as Assad consolidates his power. Will Turkey and Syria allow a Kurdish-dominated state to remain north of the Euphrates? So that's one question. What role do Turkey and Pakistan play in contemporary Middle Eastern issues? What caused the Saudi-Yemeni war? How has Oman remained neutral and isolationist in such a volatile region? I don't know if you want to take these.
Well, I feel like I want to get a lifeline over to Ara on the Turkey question, because your research area was.
I don't know. I would have to talk more about Lebanon, but my short answer is the Kurds are unfortunately a weak people. They were denied what they could have easily achieved in 1920, and it will need a global shift for them to have a state of their own. It will not be any worse than any other Arab state. I think they will be able to manage it as much as the Arabs have managed their own states. I have no doubt about that. But the balance of power is so much against them that I really don't see that happening under any circumstances. So whoever is in Damascus, whoever is in Ankara, I think is even secondary to the joint desire not to have it.
In terms of the Oman survival question, part of that is a little bit of the stance Oman has taken with respect to other neighbors. Part of that is there is Oman was sort of contested territory for some time, with different governments vying to control its monarchy. The Iranian government in the 70s sort of stabilizing that government against a largely leftist, but not 100% clear. And then so also its religious bent is not that of Sunni or Shia, so there's a little bit of an exceptionalism to Oman. Plus, historically, that area has been outward-looking and maritime power. So there's a bunch of things that sort of historically, circumstantially give Oman this kind of breathing room, where they're not obviously in a sectarian camp, they're not obviously in a sort of regional alignment. When we want to talk to Iran, we talk through Oman or Pakistan to Iran. Often is the case. So I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, but that it's been something of an exception. Where it's not an exception, unfortunately, is this sort of your choice of powerful state with a king, powerful state with a dictator, powerful state with a supreme leader. These are a lot of your options. And Oman, we shouldn't kid ourselves, Oman is not different in that sense from a lot of countries. Whatever latitude is given to people to express themselves, there are red lines that Omani citizens have to observe, just like there were for Iranians and for other folks. I think in Lebanon you have decentralized red lines, but there's red lines all over the place.
Local.
Local, right. So, and in that sense, it's not totally exceptional in that sense, but.
So I think that's a nice segue to talk about Turkey and Pakistan. It's important to remember that these are two countries that were both member states in a bygone defense pact known as the Central Nations Treaty Organization, which was basically NATO East.
Iran dropped out. We're sorry.
I'm sorry?
Iran dropped out. We're sorry.
Yeah, I think Iraq did too. Actually, it was also named the Baghdad Pact, and caused Nasser to blow a gasket, which then made him get on all Arab radio and openly call for the ouster of the king and also Nouri al-Said, the Anglophile prime minister. Turkey and Pakistan have historically had very close relations, irrespective of whether they were Kemalists or Islamists in the case of Erdogan, and irrespective of whether there were democracies or dictatorships in Pakistan. And Pakistan has always played this role of a pivot point. As you said, I mean, it has served as a liaison. The Iranian mission in Washington is actually in the embassy of Pakistan. Pakistan in the early 1970s was the conduit between the Nixon administration and Mao Zedong. It was Yahya Khan who, in fact, delivered the communique, which then, quote unquote, opened China to the United States and to the West. And although the United States has really shifted its major priority in the area toward India, which has a far larger market and much more potential for trade and other kind of commercial interaction, Pakistan cannot be ignored. It is considered to be right now, I think, the possessor of the fourth largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. That's no small potatoes. And despite Saudi Arabia's claim that Pakistan is simply its off-site facility for its nuclear weapons, I don't think that the Pakistani intelligence community or the military feels that way. And again, given China's relationship with Pakistan, a $46 billion investment in Pakistani infrastructure, including the port at Gwadar, it's going to play an instrumental role, as will Iran, connecting into Turkey as well. So I think we're going to see that both of these countries, in whatever capacity they can, we also have to understand that these are asymmetric regarding what Turkey's economy is, what Pakistan's economy and capabilities are. But as we see in some of these situations, stability and economic power aren't the only two factors and variables in being influential.
With all these countries that we're talking about, Turkey would be included, but there's also this, Iran definitely is in this box, and I think it sounds like it's an issue in Lebanon. And even if you think about Israel, the Palestinians, the notion of sort of fundamental economic inequality sort of all throughout the region, just like that's a complaint here in the States, that's a complaint there too. And that's where these sort of global forces, sort of where the rubber meets the road. Because there's a sense of being both close to opportunities that are global. If you're in a place like Iran, South Korean tourists, yay! Chinese investment, hurrah! But also a sense that those powers like the West before it or currently have an outsized influence. And then on top of that, their own local government, whether it's Erdogan's Turkey or Khamenei's Islamic Republic, or any of these governments, that they're presiding over a kind of collaboration with global capital that they're going to profit from at the expense of everybody else. And so there is, when our politicians complain about jobs to China, there's a version of that discussion in almost every country. In Iran, all our water is being sent to Kuwait, somehow, magically. That's the complaint people will say. All of the Zionist food is being exported to Kuwait. Of course, but it's a paranoid thing. But that's the sense of a weird kind of regional zero sum that's based fundamentally in a sense of unequal access to even natural resources now. We talk about oil. One thing you can't do with oil is drink it. And that's in that region, that's a big issue with growing populations. Even when you talk about some of the solutions to energy, like nuclear, forgetting about the other problems that are there, nuclear requires a lot of water. And even that can go wrong. Fukushima. So,
The Chernobyl miniseries.
That's right. Yeah. I mean,
All right, well, so I'm looking at the clock. So
Okay.
I want to thank our participants all very much.
Thank you.